Alright, and welcome to the second part of this course. Now in the first part of the course I pretty much got your feet wet straight away. However, we didn't cover the core concept of Phonegap. Now to understand the core concept of Phonegap, you must first learn the difference between the native side of the application and the non-native side of the application. Now it's important that you note your HTML, CSS and JavaScript files are non-native files, meaning the device cannot interpret and render those alone. So, of course, the perfect tool for the job is a web browser. So what Phonegap does is use the device's browser to render your HTML, CSS and JavaScript files. However, it is a Chromeless browser, meaning it doesn't have any home buttons, it doesn't have an address bar, it's just dedicated to rendering your files. So as you can see, this is the underlining concept of Phonegap, and then of course what we can do is we can take that application and distribute it across multiple platforms and devices. Now Phonegap is more than just a Chromeless browser rendering your files. Phonegap allows you to communicate between the native and non-native side of the application. This is the truly powerful stuff with Phonegap. Essentially, Phonegap has a JavaScript API, and using that JavaScript API I can communicate with the native side of the application. This allows me to gain access to the device's accelerometer, to take a picture with the camera, to get a recording from the microphone, access the file system, and more. Now, it also communicates from the native side to the non-native side, and so I can retrieve that information back and display it inside of my application. That's the true power of Phonegap. We don't need to know any native code. We just need to know the Phonegap JavaScript API, and once you've learnt that, you can then start communicating with the native side of the application. It's incredibly powerful and incredibly easy. Now let's take a look at the overall flowchart of how things work. First we start out with the IDEs. This could be Dreamweaver or Eclipse, or whichever IDE you use. Then we start to compile the project together. Now it adds the necessary JS libraries to the project. Because we are communicating to the native side of the application using JavaScript. So obviously we need those necessary JavaScript libraries to communicate with the native side of the application. So essentially it will add that to our project. And as you can see, when we set up Eclipse, you'll be able to see that this JS file is in the www folder, and that JS file allows us to gain access to the Phonegap API. Without it, it would be impossible. Also, with the project that we first did with Dreamweaver, you can see that after I clicked on the build, it actually added this Phonegap JS file to the project. So, as you can see, the JS libraries are necessary to gain access to the Phonegap API. Then it all gets boxed up, including any plugins that you may include. And then Phonegap will, of course, build it all so you can distribute to a range of platform and devices. You can emulate it, you can actually install it on a tablet or smartphone device. So this is the overall workflow of Phonegap. Now it's time to get our feet wet with the Phonegap API. Okay, so let's open up Dreamweaver, and just a quick note, I have changed the project's root directory to point to this www folder inside my Eclipse project. So that will allow me to create and edit my HTML, CSS and JavaScript files in Dreamweaver, and then I can go over to Eclipse and obviously export it with the latest version of Phonegap, so I get the best of both worlds. So I'm going to go back to Dreamweaver, and now what I want to do is I want to attach this JavaScript file to my index.html file. Now treat this JavaScript file of Phonegap the same as you would with any other JavaScript library. For example, Jquery. If you want to use Jquery, then you must embed the library first, and then you can access the Jquery API. It's the same thing with Phonegap. If I want to use Phonegap on this page, I must first embed this Phonegap.js file, and then I can access the Phonegap API. So what I'm going to do is, in between my two head tags, I'm going to put in a script tag with a source. I'm going to browse, and I want to click on Phonegap 1.3.0. Type is equal to text / JavaScript. Like so. Very easy and very, very simple. So the next thing that I want to do is actually include Jquery. So I go to jquery.com, and I want to download the developer version. That's very important. Now, I would normally download the production version and use that. However, Eclipse has a JavaScript validator, and unfortunately the production version of Jquery doesn't pass validation. And if you have one error in your Eclipse project, just like we had that little red X on that XML file, you cannot export to an Android application. It will simply say, no, you have to go back and fix the error. So unfortunately, I have to use the development version of Jquery. And I want to create a new JavaScript file. Paste that in there. Save it. We'll call this Jquery. And we'll also create a new empty JavaScript file, and this is where we'll be putting our JavaScript, and we'll just call it myapp.js. Okay, so now I have all my files. I want to link them all up, so I'm just going to copy and paste that twice, and the next one down we shall say jQuery.js. And the next one down is myapp.js. And save. Okay, so now we have all our files linked up. If you want to quickly refresh your relative files in Dreamweaver, just click on that top dark bar right there and hit F5, and you'll see that it refreshes and it shows us the current relative files. So now what we've done is set up the very basic project. So now it's time to actually start using the Phonegap API. Okay, so now what we need to do is lay the basic foundations for our application. So what do I mean by this? Well, what we need to do is wait for all the dependencies to load, and then finally we can get into really the nitty-gritty stuff. So this is what every application should do. Now the first thing you should do is wait until the DOM has finished loading, because if we are referencing elements in our JavaScript and they haven't loaded yet, then technically to the application they don't exist, and therefore you can get errors. So you must wait until the DOM has finished loading. That's the first thing we must wait for. So on the opening body tag, we want to put a onload event. So as soon as the DOM has finished loading, then we want to call back a function. Now we haven't made a function in JavaScript yet. However, I'm just going to say call back the DOM loaded function, and don't forget to put your opening and closing brackets. So I can save that now, and we can go to the file myapp.js. So I want to now create that function, because at the moment it's basically looking for thin air. So I'm going to create a function like so. We give the function a name, and it is case sensitive, so it's like so, DOM loaded. And then we open and close the brackets, and we open and close the parentheses. So what's going to happen is, as soon as the DOM has finished loading, it's going to call back this function, and then it's going to execute whatever is in between these two parentheses. So that's pretty much done for waiting for the DOM. Now we need to move on to Phonegap. We don't want to be accessing the Phonegap API if the Phonegap JavaScript library hasn't fully loaded. And the same with Jquery. But the first library that we are going to check to make sure that it's loaded is the Phonegap JavaScript library. So the way we do that is we add an event listener to our document itself, this document right here. So all I have to do is say document dot, and then we need to add an event listener. So add, all lowercase, event with a capital E and listener with a capital L. Basically it's camel casing. And the first thing we need to do is, inside of these brackets, we need to establish this event listener. Now, this event listener is not a regular event listener. It's not like a button click or a hover and so forth like you normally do with JavaScript. However, this is a custom event. So, this event name is called device ready. So inside of quotation marks, I've written the custom event name, which is device ready, meaning it's a non-standard event. So in order to have that event, you must have this Phonegap JavaScript library linked to your page. And so what device ready is going to do is it's going to keep on querying and querying and querying until Phonegap responds. And it's that simple. Then I'm going to put a comma in, and so what happens when Phonegap is ready? Well, then we need to call back a function. So this is the next part. You put a comma in, and then we need to put the callback function in. So the name of the function, which is Phonegap loaded. So we don't put the opening and closing brackets in, okay? We just type the name in. Then we put in a comma. And of course, if it isn't true, then it must be false. So if it's true, it's going to call back this function, which doesn't exist yet. But if it's true, it's going to call back that function. If it's false, it's just going to keep on looping round and around and around and around and keep querying and querying and querying until it gets what it wants. It's like a little nagging kid. So that's what it's all about right there. So now what we need to do is create another function. And we need to give the function a name of Phonegap loaded. So this will be the function that is called back when Phonegap is ready. And now we need to check to make sure that Jquery has loaded, which if you've used Jquery before, you know it's very, very easy. Put in the $, function, like so. So that's basically just going to check to make sure Jquery is loaded. It will also check to make sure the DOM has loaded, but the DOM would have already loaded by that time, so it doesn't really matter. We're just really with that, we're just checking to make sure Jquery is loaded. The DOM would have finished loading by that time. Okay, so now what I need to do is I need to actually do something. This is the nitty-gritty part of it. So I'm just going to do something dead basic and dead simple. I'm just going to attach a header1 element to the body element, and it'll just say, you know, this device is ready. So I'm going to point to it. I'm going to say .append, so I'm calling the append method. In quotation marks, I'm going to add in a header1 element, and this header1 will just say device is ready. And then we need to end our brackets and end with a semicolon. Okay, so now that we have this, I can save it. Now, don't build it in Dreamweaver. What we want to do is go over to Eclipse, and you might want to hit F5 to quickly refresh your project, like so. But don't worry about it anyway, because it will automatically refresh when you go to export for Android. So right click on it, click on export, export Android application. That's the right project. Put in your password for your license. And click on finish. It's just giving us a little warning saying the destination file already exists, but doesn't matter, we'll override it. And then what we need to do is install the application. So I'm going to open up my HTC software, click on application installer, and I'm going to click on the mycartoons.apk, install. Okay, now what I'm going to do, let's quickly show you this. Okay, so here it is, the home screen. I've deleted the other application, and I'm just going to tap on it, and there we go, the device is ready. So it shows you that it's very, very fast, but you do have to remember that this is an extremely basic project that we have here. You know, there's nothing really to it. So now essentially what we've done is we've checked to make sure that all the dependencies are loaded, and that's very, very important. Now this device ready event, essentially that is supported by Android, iOS, and BlackBerry WebWorks OS 5.0 and higher. So what about if we were developing this application for, let's say, the BlackBerry OS 4.0, which obviously the BlackBerry OS 4.0 doesn't support custom events in its browser, so therefore it won't allow this event listener, because this is a custom event. So with the BlackBerry, it has to be OS 5.0 and higher. Anything lower than 5.0, it won't work, because its browser doesn't support custom events. So we have to manually query it. We have to manually set up a nagging system that's going to keep on checking to see if Phonegap is ready, and when it is ready, then we can stop nagging. So what we need to do is delete out this code right here. This is a real quick demonstration of what we have to do. Create a variable. This variable is going to contain our interval. An interval means looping round and around and around and around. And then of course when we get what we want, we can delete or clear the interval. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to give this variable a name, very important. My interval, let's call it. Okay. And I'll say equals window dot set interval, as you can see, set interval. So first of all we have to define the code. What is it going to keep on repeating and repeating and repeating and repeating? And then how often is it repeating? The delay. So it's not very difficult at all. So set interval. First of all it wants the code. So in order to do that we're going to create a function. Okay, we don't need to give this function a name because we aren't calling it back. It's just going to be constantly looped and looped and looped until we get what we want. So inside of that function, okay, is going to contain that code that we want to keep on looping round and around. So I'm going to create an if statement. So if Phonegap with a capital P and a capital G dot available whoops, spelled that a little bit wrong, and then I want to end the bracket. So that is the condition of the if statement. So if Phonegap is available, then we want to say window dot clear interval, and then we need to put the interval ID, which is stored in this variable right here. So we just use the variable name like so, and then we can call back a function, which is obviously going to be our Phonegap loaded function like so. Okay. And then what we need to do is obviously close that parenthesis right there. So we have a closing one there, closing one there. We also need to have an ending bracket and semicolon because we started a bracket up here. So we have to end it down there. So let's just minimize that because we don't need to see that. Okay, so now we need to set the delay. Well, this is the function, so this is the code. So as you can see, I need to put a comma right next to that parenthesis. And then in milliseconds, I need to say how often is it going to repeat this function. So I can just say 500 milliseconds. So it's not in seconds, it's milliseconds. So let's take a look. We've created a variable that's containing our interval, and we're telling the window to set an interval. Okay, and when we open the brackets, we are first telling it the code that we want it to repeat over and over and over again until we get the result we want, which is it's going to check over and over again if Phonegap is available. Now if Phonegap isn't available, the interval still stands and it keeps going back and back and back and back and back until Phonegap is available. When Phonegap is available, then this condition is true, and then it's going to run whatever is in between those opening and closing parentheses, which is window clear interval. So we stop the nagging session carrying on and we call back this function. So essentially, instead of using a custom event, which we can't use in the BlackBerry OS 4 browser because it doesn't support custom events, we have to manually query and see if Phonegap is available. So as you can see, that's how you manually do it. But obviously, if you are developing your application for the Android, the iOS, or the BlackBerry OS 5.0 and higher, then you should be fine using the custom event. So let's undo all of that so that we are back with our custom event. Much cleaner and much easier. However, it just shows you a little workaround if you want to make sure that Phonegap is properly loaded and then calling back the function and getting on with whatever it is you need to do by using the Phonegap API. So essentially all we're doing right now is we are just setting a basic platform in which to work off, and your application should always check to make sure that they have all the dependencies loaded before continuing. Okay, so now I want to show you the notification API inside of Phonegap. And the notification API is particularly important for capturing the user's attention, and it's very easy to use. So what we're first going to do is create an alert dialog box. I'm going to delete out my old code. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to create an anchor tag. And that anchor tag is pointing to nowhere. Then what I'm going to do is put an onClick event onto this anchor tag. So as soon as this anchor tag is clicked on, we want to call back the alert function. And if we cannot call the alert function, then we want to say return false. Okay. And I'm just going to put a header1 element inside of the anchor tag, and we'll just say alert. And we'll save that file, and we'll go over to the myapp.js file, and I'm just going to create that function now. So I've created the function, giving the function a name, which is the alert function. So this is the function that is called back when the anchor tag is clicked. And so now what I'm going to do is I'm going to point to the Navigator object, and then what I'm going to do is say dot, and now what we need to do is use the notification.alert method. And then open and close our brackets and end with a semicolon. Now in between those two opening and closing brackets, what we first want to define is the message that our alert dialog box is going to display, and we want to put the message inside of quotation marks. Very, very important. So I'm just going to say hello world, then I'm going to put in a comma, and then what I'm going to do is define the callback function. So as soon as the alert dialog box is dismissed, basically once they've clicked the button on the alert dialog box and the dialog box goes away, we want to call back a function. So I'm just going to call this function dismissed. And then I'm going to put in a comma. Now I can optionally define a title for my alert dialog box. Now if you don't define a title for your alert dialog box, it will just default to alert. Now I want my title to say cartoonsmart, and then I'm going to put in a comma, and I'm going to optionally define the button label. And if you don't define the button label, it will just default to OK. But my button is going to say done. Okay, now what we need to do is create this callback function that we have right here. Like so. Now I could just leave it at that. Alright, now I do need to create the callback function, but the callback function doesn't have to do anything. However, I will do something. What I'll do is I will put in a bit of Jquery right here. And what we'll do is we'll point to the body element and we'll just quickly append a header 1 to our body element, and it'll just say dismissed. Then we need to close the brackets and end with a semicolon, and I can save that now. And so what we're going to do is we are going to export the application. So right click on it, export, and click on finish. And then we're going to install it on the device. And then we're going to pull that up. And I'm going to tap on my application. And as you can see, we have this alert link right here, so I can click on that. And it will open up an alert dialog box. As you can see, I've defined the title as cartoonsmart. If I didn't define the title, then I would have an alert title right there. Then I have my message, and I've also defined my button label. Now if I didn't define my button label, it would default to OK. So I'm going to click on done, and as you can see, as soon as I have dismissed this dialog box, it calls back that function, and of course that function is just appending this header 1 element to our body element. So as you can see, it's very simple and very easy to use the notification.alert method. Now the notification.alert method is supported on the Android platform, the BlackBerry OS 4.6 platform, the BlackBerry WebWorks OS 5.0 and higher, the iPhone, and Windows Phone 7 Mango. Okay, now there is a little bit of a quirk with this notification.alert method. Basically, the Windows Phone 7 ignores your button label and it just says OK. So that's just a little bit of a quirk, but not really a major thing. Okay. So now what we're going to do is we're going to create a confirmation dialog box. So what I'm going to do is delete this code out, and I'm going to change the callback function to confirmation. So that it's more relative to what we're doing, and again I want to return false if it can't do that, and I'll change the text of the link to say confirm. Right, save that, and we'll go back to the myapp.js file, and I'm going to create the confirmation function. So I say function confirmation, open close the brackets and open and close the parentheses. Now you'll notice that the code we're about to type is very similar to the way that we created the alert dialog box. So what I'm going to do is, again, I'm going to point to the Navigator object, then I'm going to say dot, and now we want to use the notification.confirm method. And then we want to open and close our brackets and end with a semicolon. Now what we want to do is first define the message for our confirmation dialog box in quotation marks, and we'll just say, what bread would you like? Okay. Then what we're going to do is put a comma after the quotation marks, and we want to define a callback function. So I'm just going to call this callback function on confirm. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to optionally define the title. Now if you don't define the title, it will just default to confirm. So I'm going to put a comma in and define my title. So I'll just say bread as the title of my confirmation dialog box. Then I'm going to put a comma in and optionally create my button labels. Now if you don't create your button labels, then basically it will just default to OK and cancel. So I'm going to put a comma in after the quotation marks, and in quotation marks I want to first of all define the first button label. So I'm just going to say whole grain, then I'm going to put a comma in. So after the comma, I'm now going to define the second button label, which is going to be brown bread. Then I'm going to put another comma in, and I'm optionally going to add in a third button. Now you can only have 3 buttons maximum. So my third button will say white bread. So as you can see, I have 3 buttons. Obviously I don't have to have the third button, I could just have 2 buttons if I wish. And if you don't define the button labels, then it will just default to 2 buttons saying OK and cancel. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to create this callback function, and this is where the interesting stuff happens. So I say function on confirm, and then what I need to do is pass in an argument to this function, and this argument is going to contain the value 1, 2 or 3. So as you can see, I have 3 buttons here. The first button has the value of 1, the second button has the value of 2, and again these are all separated out by commas, and the third button has the value of 3. So we can actually change what this callback function does depending on which button the user has clicked. And in order to do that, we need to pass in the argument button. So inside of the brackets we need to write button, and then we can open and close our parentheses. Now think of this argument as a variable, okay, and this variable is simply containing a number, and that number is either going to be 1, 2 or 3. And obviously if you only had 2 buttons, it would only contain 1 or 2 depending on which one the user has clicked. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to open up my parentheses, and I'm going to create an if statement. So I'm going to say if, and then I'm going to open my brackets, and now I need to write my condition, and my condition is basically going to check this button argument and see if it's equal to 1. So it's going to check the button value, and it's going to see if it has the value of 1. If it has the value of 1, then the user has clicked on this whole grain button. And so then what I want to do is I want to put in a little bit of code right here. We'll just use Jquery again. And we'll keep this all on one line to keep things nice and clean. And I want to point to the body element, and I want to append a header1 element like so, and I'll end my brackets and end my semicolon, and this header1 element will say whole grain. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to copy that if statement and paste it below, and now I'm going to check to see if button has the value of 2. Now you'll notice, by the way, that I've done 2 equal signs. That is very, very important. 1 equal sign in JavaScript means you're assigning something, but we are not assigning anything to this argument, okay? We are checking. So make sure you do an equals equals, that's very important. So I'm saying, okay, if button has the value equal to 2, then run what's ever inside of these two parentheses. And of course, if it has the value of 2, then they've clicked on this brown bread button. So I'm just going to say brown bread. Then I'm going to paste this if statement in one more time because we've created the optional third button. So button can have the value of 3, so we want to check to see if button has the value of 3. And then of course they've clicked on the third button, which is white bread. Like so. Okay, so what I can do now is save this and export my application. And just click on finish. And then what I'm going to do is install the application, and then I'm going to open it up. Okay, so now I'm going to open up my application, and as you can see I have this confirm link. I'm going to click on the confirm link and it opens up my confirmation dialog box. Now I've defined a title of bread. Again, if I didn't define the title of bread, then it would just default to confirm. I have my message right here, and then if I didn't define my button labels, then I would just simply have 2 buttons saying OK and cancel. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to press whole grain. And as you can see, it's added the header 1 element to our body element, and that's saying whole grain. I'm going to click on it again, and this time I'm going to click on white bread. And as you can see, it's added the header 1 element of white bread. I'm going to click on it again, and this time I'm going to choose the option of brown bread. And as you can see, it's added the brown bread header 1 element to our body element. So as you can see, you can do lots of fun and interesting stuff with this dialog box. And the notification.confirm method has support for Android, BlackBerry WebWorks OS 5.0 and higher. It also has support on the iPhone and Windows Phone 7. Now there is a little bit of a quirk with this notification.confirm method on the Windows Phone 7 platform. Basically it ignores your button labels just like it did with the alert dialog box, and it just defaults to OK and cancel. So that will be a little bit of a problem here, so what we probably have to do is create a series of alert boxes and so forth. So again, that is how you create a confirmation dialog box inside of the Phonegap API. So what we want to do now is we want to take a look at the notification.beep method and the notification.vibrate method. So what I'm going to do is delete out this code, and I'm going to go back to my index.html file, and we're going to create 2 links. And the first link is going to call back the beep function, and again, if it cannot call back the beep function, then we want to return false. So what I'm going to do is inside of there I'm going to say beep. So that's the text for the link. And then what I want to do is copy that and paste it below. And this anchor tag is going to call back the vibrate function. And I'm just going to say vibrate. And then what we're going to do is save that we're going to go to the myapp.js file, and we're going to create those two functions. So I'm going to say function beep. So this is the function that's called back once the anchor tag has been clicked, which is this anchor tag right here, our first anchor tag. And then what we're going to do is point to the Navigator object again, and we're going to say dot notification dot beep. So we are using the notification dot beep method, and I want to open and close my brackets and end with a semicolon. Now in between these two opening and closing brackets, we want to define how many times we want the device to beep. So I'll just say 4 times. Okay, let's move that all up on one line so it looks nice and clean. Okay, now what I'm going to do is create the second function, and this is going to be the Vibrate function. And again, I'm going to point to the Navigator object, and then we want to use the notification.vibrate method. And we're going to open and close our brackets and end with a semicolon. Now in between these two opening and closing brackets, I want to define the time in milliseconds of how long I want the device to vibrate for. So I could say 2000 milliseconds, which is 2 seconds. Okay, so now what I'm going to do is I'm going to save that and export my application. Okay, so now what I'm going to do is click on Application Installer, and I'm going to install my application. And then what we're going to do is we're going to open this up, and now we have our beep and vibrate links. So you can click on beep first. There's 1 beep, 2 beeps, 3 beeps, and 4 beeps. Now I'm going to click on the vibrate link, and hopefully you could hear that, but yes, the device was vibrating for 2 seconds. Okay, so the notification.beep method is supported by the Android platform, BlackBerry OS 4.6, BlackBerry WebWorks OS 5.0 and higher. It's also supported by the iPhone and Windows Phone 7 Mango. Now the notification.beep API has a few little quirks with a few of those different platforms. First of all, Android plays the default notification ringtone that's specified under the sound settings of that device. Now, that's not really a big issue with the Android platform. At least we are getting the beeping noise. Now, the iPhone has a little bit more of an issue with the notification.beep method. Basically, the iPhone ignores the beep count argument. So that means there is no native beep API for the iPhone. But Phonegap gets around this by playing an audio file via the media API. And you have to specify that file's beep tone. And what you need to do is you need to create a WAV file. That's very important. It needs to be in the WAV format, and it needs to be less than 30 seconds long. And you need to name the file beep.wav. That's very, very important. So what you need to do is include your beep.wav file in the root directory of your www folder, and then Phonegap will use the Media API to play that file, and then of course you can get the beeps. So that's actually pretty cool. And also the Windows Phone 7 platform has a little bit of an issue with the notification.beep method, but Phonegap implements a lib file that is basically containing the generic beep file that is used to beep, and that's pretty much it. So okay, there are a few little quirks with it, but overall it's not really that major. You can easily get around it with the iPhone. The Android just plays the native beeping ringtone, which is fine, and Windows Phone 7 is taken care of by Phonegap. So it's not too bad, it's got pretty good support. Now the notification.vibrate method is supported by Android, BlackBerry OS 4.6, BlackBerry WebWorks OS 5.0 and higher. It's also supported on the iPhone and Windows Phone 7. Now this notification.vibrate method has a little bit of an issue on the iPhone. The iPhone ignores your timing for the vibration, and it vibrates for a preset amount of time. So the iPhone controls how long it will vibrate, but that's it. Okay, so as you can see, you can use the notification API inside of Phonegap to really grab the user's attention. Okay, now there may be a point in time in which you want to gather more information about the device that your application is running on. So the way that we do that is we use the device API inside of Phonegap. So what I'm going to do is delete my two functions out here because we don't need those anymore, and I'm going to delete both of my anchor tags, and I'm going to create a div element, and basically what we're going to do is tell JavaScript to go get all the information that we need, and then we're going to display it inside of this div element. So I'm going to create a div with an ID so that we can refer back to it later in JavaScript, and I'll just give it an ID of device info. And it'll just have, you know, loading device information, like so. So basically we don't have to worry about any child elements of this element, and we'll get onto that later on. But I'm just going to save this now, and I'm going to open up the myapp.js file. Now I want this code to execute as soon as the application is loaded up. So we're left with the basic boilerplate, waiting for the DOM to load, then waiting for Phonegap to load, and then it's calling back this function right here. And so what I'm first going to do is create a variable, and this variable is going to target that DOM element. So let's give this variable a name. I'm going to say equals document. So we're looking inside of this document right here, and we want to get the element by its ID. So as you can see, get is all lowercase, element with a capital E, by with a capital B, and ID with a capital I, very important. Then we open up our brackets, open up our quotation marks, and as you can see, Dreamweaver has very cleverly gone over to our document, and it's found all the DOM elements with an ID, and we can also look at what type of element it is. Now obviously I only have one element with an ID, so that's what I'm going to choose. And then we end the brackets and end with a semicolon. Now what we're going to do is we're going to use the inner HTML method in JavaScript. So what that does is it strips out all the child elements and all the text and so forth out of that div, and then it will display the information that we want. So don't worry about this information right here, because that will be deleted as soon as Phonegap has given us all the information and JavaScript can display it. So what I'm going to do is point to the variable, which is essentially pointing to that DOM element, and then we're using the inner HTML method. So we say dot inner is all lowercase and HTML is all capitals, very important. And then we're going to say equals. Now what we need to do is put our HTML in quotation marks. Very, very important that our HTML goes in quotation marks. Now I recommend single quotes because that's a little bit better. And what we're going to do is first of all get the device's name. Now I'm going to code this all out and then I'm going to go through each property and explain what it does. So I'm just going to say device name, and then what I'm going to do is outside of the quotation marks I want to say plus. So think of this like adding something to our script, and we want to add some JavaScript. And what we're going to do is we want to use the device.name property. Like so. So this will get the device's name. And again, I'll explain more in depth later on. And then I want to add something more to our script. So as you can see, our HTML is inside of our quotation marks. Then outside of the quotation marks, I've said plus. That means I want to add something to our script, whether that be HTML or whatever it is, or JavaScript. So I'm adding a bit of JavaScript right here, and then I'm saying plus or add something more to our script, and I just want to add in a line break like so. And then I want to add some more HTML. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to copy that because we're going to need it for a little while, because obviously we can extract more information. So the next bit of information we want to get is what version of Phonegap is our application using. So I'm going to say Phonegap version, and then I want to, outside of the quotation marks, I'm going to say plus. I want to add some JavaScript, and now we want to use the device.phonegap property. And then we're going to add in another line break. Basically all I'm doing there is like I'm just going down on a new line instead of budging all the information up right next to each other, because that can make it look very messy and not very clean. Okay, so let's say the next bit of information is I want to get the device's platform. For example, is it Android and so forth. So I'm just going to say platform, and then what we want to do is use the device.platform property, like so. And then again we're going to add something more to our script, and basically we're just adding a little bit of HTML that's breaking it off onto a new line. Okay, and let's say that the next bit of information that we want is the Uuid. Now I'll explain this one in detail later on, but what I'm going to do is say devices Uuid, and we want to use, so we say plus, so I want to add something to our script, I want to add a little bit of JavaScript, and I want to use the device.uuid property. And again, break on to a new line. I want to add some more HTML, so we're going on to a new line and then adding some more HTML. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to say, let's say that the next bit of information that I want to get is the device version, which is the version of the operating system. So I'm going to say OS version, And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to, outside of the quotation marks again, say plus, and now I want to use the device.version property. And we just want to change that last plus to a semicolon. So these are all the properties that we have, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to save this now, and I'm going to export my application for Android. Then we are going to install it. And then what we're going to do now is click on the application, and it's pretty much instantaneous, but it's got all that information. So basically it's stripped out that text right there because we're using the inner HTML method, and it's now giving us all of the pieces of information that we have requested. So the device's name is HTC_Saga. Now the device.name property returns the name of the device's model or product. Now this value is set by the device's manufacturer and may be different across versions of the same product. So I have a HTC Desire and it's coming back as HTC_Saga. Now the device.name property has a little bit of a quirk on the Android platform. Basically, Android gets the product name instead of the model name. The product name is often the code name given during the device's production. For example, the Nexus 1 returns Passion and the Motorola Droid returns Vols because that was the name given to the device during production. Also, with the device.name property, there's a little bit of a quirk with the iPhone. Now basically, the iPhone gets the device's custom name instead of the device's model name. And the custom name is set by the owner in iTunes. So for example, if I was to create a custom name for my phone, I would plug it into iTunes and give it the name of Lawrence's iPhone. And basically the device.name property will bring back the custom name Lawrence's iPhone instead of the device's name. So that's a little bit of a downside, but not really a major issue. The next bit of information we have is the Phonegap version. Obviously that's retrieving the version of Phonegap that my application is running on, which is 1.3.0. And the platform is Android, so obviously this is reporting back the platform name. So we have Android, BlackBerry, iOS, and so forth. However, the device.platform property has a few quirks. Number one, the iPhone returns iPhone as its platform, which technically is inaccurate because Apple rebranded the iPhone OS to the iOS. So technically it's inaccurate, but still you can determine pretty much what device they're running on from that information. Also, with the device.platform property, there is a little bit of an issue with BlackBerry devices. They may return the device platform version instead of the platform name. So for example, the Storm 2 9550 would return 2.13.0.95, which of course is the platform version, not the platform name. So there's a little bit of a quirk with that device.platform property on the iPhone and the BlackBerry. However, the device.phonegap property, the device.uuid property, and the device.version property doesn't have any quirks. So that's pretty good. So obviously you can see that the device.platform property is giving us the name of the platform, but be wary of some of the quirks. Now the device UUID gets the universally unique identifier. Now the UUID is generated by the device manufacturer and specific to the device's platform or model. Then we have the OS version. So I'm running Android 2.3.3. So that's getting the version of the operating system. So as you can see, this is pretty cool, and we've got plenty of information to go on right here. And now what I want to do is talk about the support. Okay, so the device.name property and the device.phonegap property, as well as the device.platform, and finally the device.uuid property are supported by Android, BlackBerry, BlackBerry WebWorks OS 5.0 and higher, iPhone, and Windows Phone 7. Now the device.version property has pretty much the same support, however it is supported on the Android 2.1 and above, BlackBerry WebWorks OS 5.0 and higher. It's supported as well on the iPhone and the Windows Phone 7 Mango. So as you can see, the device API has pretty good support overall. And okay, there is a little bit of a quirk with the device.name property and also the device.platform property, but everything else works very smoothly on those operating systems. So it seems very, very well supported. So what we're going to do now is we're going to take a look at the connection API, because you may want to actually find out more information about how the user is connected to the internet, or if they are not connected at all, and change the way your application actually functions depending on what type of connection the user has or whether they have no internet connection. So now let's say that I want to know the connection type of the device, and the way we do that is we use the connection API. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to delete this out. Also, I'm going to delete that div out because we don't need it anymore. Okay, and I'm going to create another function like so. So function, and then we are going to give this function a name so we can call it back later. So I'm going to say network connection with a capital C. And then we're going to open and close the brackets and open and close the parentheses. And now what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a variable, and this variable is going to hold the network state. So I'm just going to give this variable a name of network state. And to actually get the connection type of the device, we need to say Navigator dot network dot connection dot type, like so. Real easy and real simple. So now what we need to do is we need to look at all the different states that we possibly could have, and then we need to display some information to the user. So I'm going to create a variable, give it a name of states, equals, and then I'm going to open and close my parentheses and end with a semicolon. Then I'm going to point to that variable by saying states. I'm going to open and close my square brackets, and inside of there I'm going to say connection dot unknown. Like so. So if this guy right here has returned the value of connection.unknown, then I want to display a string basically to the user that says unknown connection. I'm putting ending semicolon there. Okay, so that's obviously one of the states, but let's take a look at a few others. So now we're going to say connection.ethernet. Okay, so we're looking for an Ethernet connection. So then I can say inside of here you have an Ethernet connection. We could also have a Wi-Fi connection. And then what we want to do is say cell underscore 2G. So if we have a cellular 2G connection, this is the value that will be stored inside of that variable. And then we want to display some information to the user saying you have a 2G connection. And you know what, we'll copy that guy and we'll paste him in. Alright, because in this day and age we have a 3G connection and we also have a 4G connection. And so the last value that this possibly could have, this variable could have, then we want to say none. Okay, so if there is no connection. Okay, so now what I need to do is create an alert dialog box, and what we'll do is we'll just say network state, and then we're going to say outside of the brackets plus states, then put my square brackets in, and I'm going to put in that variable name right there, so I'm going to point to that variable. Okay, and then I'm going to end my brackets and end with a semicolon. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to save this and export it and install it on my device. But just before I jump the gun, alright, we don't want to go too fast right here. Don't forget that we need to call back this function. So as soon as Phonegap is ready and waiting, we are going to trigger this function, and then it's going to basically find out what connection type we have. So I've gone ahead and done that, so let's open this guy up. And straight away we get an alert dialog box that says we have a Wi-Fi connection, okay, as you can see right there. So basically what's happened is this guy right here has requested from the native side of the application the connection type, and it's returned a value, okay, which is going to be one of these values right here, and it's storing that value inside of this variable. And so what we're going to do is we're going to have a look at that value, okay, and obviously at this specific point in time that variable is holding the connection.Wi-Fi value, and so we are going to display the Wi-Fi connection string like that right there. Okay, so states, and then in the square brackets we have network state. Okay, and as you can see, it hopefully makes a lot of sense. So what we can do now is we can take this off Wi-Fi, okay, and then we can put it on a cellular network, which is a 3G network in my case. So mobile network, cool. Alright, so here's the guy right here. Okay, as you can see up the top 3G. So we have a 3G connection. We're going to open up the application, and as you can see, it says 3G connection because obviously this has requested from the native side of the application the connection type, and it's returned the value of connection.cell_3G. Okay, and that value again is stored inside of that network state variable, and so that is the string that we are displaying. Nice and easy and very, very simple. And this is great for functionality because some of your applications will require an internet connection, so you could possibly alert them to the fact that the application will be limited in features and they need to connect to the internet. Also, if they're on a 2G, 3G and 4G connection, they need to know that they possibly could be charged, or you could possibly load in, you know, lower quality images and stuff like that to help the speed of the application. So that's really, really great, and that is the Connection API. Now the Connection API is supported on the iOS, Android, Windows Phone 7 Mango and the BlackBerry WebWorks OS 5.0 and higher platforms. So now what we're going to do is take a look at the Accelerometer API inside of Phonegap. Now what this will allow us to do is extract information from the accelerometer sensor that's inside of the device. Now you're probably going, what is the accelerometer sensor? Well, it's basically tracking the movement relative to the current device orientation. Now the accelerometer sensor is used a lot in games. So for example, you have to tilt the phone to move a skier, or you have to tilt the phone to move a ball around the stage, and so forth and so on. So the accelerometer is used a lot in games, and Phonegap allows us to extract that information, and we can do whatever we want with that information then. We can display it to the user, or, you know, we could move a ball around the stage, we could make a game that uses the accelerometer, and so on and so forth. So this is really, really cool. Now, as you know, with 3D applications you have an X, Y and Z axis, okay, and the accelerometer motion sensor is no different. It has an X, Y and Z axis, and that will allow you to track 3D motion. So what we're going to do is we are going to delete out this function, and we're also going to delete this because we're no longer going to be calling back the function. And I just want to create a div with an ID so that we can point to it in JavaScript. So I'm just going to say Excel info. Just going to say loading. Save that. Go back to the myapp.js file. Okay, so as soon as Phonegap is ready and waiting, then what I want to do is I want to basically take a snapshot of the information inside of the accelerometer. So I just want to get a quick snapshot, and then I'm just going to display that information to the users. And later on we're going to move on to, you know, actually watching the accelerometer, and I'll explain the difference. So basically I'm just going to say Navigator dot accelerometer dot get current with a capital C, acceleration with a capital A, like so. And then what we need to do is define the accelerometer success callback. So I'm just going to call back the function of onSuccess, and I'm going to put a comma in here, and then we need to define the accelerometer error callback, so we'll just say on error. Okay, so if we are in fact able to get the information from the accelerometer, then we want to call back the onSuccess function, and if we are unable to get that information from the accelerometer, such as the device doesn't have the accelerometer or something went wrong, then we want to call back the onError function. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to create this onSuccess function. Okay, and now what we need to do is we need to give this function a name, and pass in the acceleration object as a parameter into this function. Okay, and now what I want to do is I want to create an alert dialog box. Okay, so inside of there I'm going to say x axis. Okay, and then we're going to say plus, and then we're going to say acceleration dot x. Okay, and then I'm going to say plus and quotation marks. I'm just going to put in a line break. Okay, so that's how we put a line break in the alert dialog box. Then I'm going to say plus. Okay. And we're just going to copy that. And obviously we have the y-axis. And I have the z-axis, so I say dot z right there. And then we also have the timestamp. So when was this snapshot taken? So I say acceleration dot time stamp. Okay, nice and easy. And then I'm just going to delete all this out. Okay, because we don't need it. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to create the onError function. So I'm just going to say function on error. And so if we were unable to get the information from the accelerometer, then we want to basically display a message of something went wrong. Just like that. Okay, so you're probably going, well, what's going off right here? Okay, so if we are successfully able to get the current acceleration from the accelerometer, then we want to call back this onSuccess function. Okay, if not, then we're going to call back this onError function if there was an error. And basically, we are passing in this acceleration object as a parameter into this function. Okay, so think of this as a parcel being delivered to you. Okay, and this parcel contains all the bits of information that you want. All right. And so basically what we're doing is we're creating an alert dialog box. I've just put a string in here saying x-axis. Okay, so that's just a simple string. And then I'm saying plus, and then what I'm doing is I'm essentially grabbing that parcel. Okay, so the parcel's been delivered, and I'm grabbing that parcel. Okay, and now I'm ripping it open, so I say .x, I'm ripping it open, and I'm finding the information on the x-axis. Okay, so that's why I'm saying .x. Okay, so that's basically what I'm doing. I get the parcel delivered, okay, and again Phonegap populates that object, and then we pass that object in as a parameter to our function. Then we point to that parameter, and then we extract the information that we want. So we have the parcel being delivered, we grab that particular parcel, and then we pull out the pieces of information that we want. So we have the x-axis, the y-axis, the z-axis, and then we have the timestamp. So when was, this snapshot taken? When was this information taken from the accelerometer? So I'm just simply saying acceleration.timestamp. So what I can do now is I can save that and I can export it and install it on my device. So I've gone ahead and done this, so let's open this guy up. Okay, and as soon as Phonegap has loaded, okay, we're executing this code right here. Alright, this function is getting triggered. And this is basically going over to the native side of the application, and it's just getting a snapshot of the information of the accelerometer. And then it's creating the acceleration object, and it's populating it, and then we pass in that object, the acceleration object, as a parameter into our onSuccess function, and then we are simply extracting the piece of information that we want. Okay, so as you can see, we have the x-axis information, we have the y-axis information, we have the z-axis information. As you can see, there's lots and lots of numbers right there, and then we have the timestamp. Okay, now the timestamp doesn't actually make a lot of sense, so what we need to do is put that inside of a date object. So we say new date, and we'll wrap some brackets around that right there, and then what we'll do is we'll save that, export it, and we'll see that basically this date object inside of JavaScript will format our timestamp properly. So what we're going to do is we are going to open this up, if I can find the mouse. There we go. And let's open this up now, and hopefully our timestamp will be formatted properly. So there you go, that makes a lot more sense. Thursday, Jan 26th, 2012. Okay, so as you can see, that makes a lot more sense, and those are all the different pieces of information. Now obviously that's not really exciting, but you have to think potential at this point. Basically you could, get a snapshot, okay, of the accelerometer information, then you could move an element or something like that to, create a game. But obviously just getting a snapshot is not really good enough, okay, because let's say we had a ball game, okay, or we had a skier game, okay, and you have to tilt the phone to the left or right to move the ball or skier, whatever game you're making. Well, you need to keep constant track of the motion of the device, okay, because otherwise you'll move it once, it captures the information, and then that's it, okay. What we want to do is we want to keep capturing that information. We want to keep going and keep going and keep going and keep going, and so what that will allow us to do is keep track of the motion of the device, and so they can keep playing the game. Otherwise, if we use the accelerometer.getCurrentAcceleration method, they'll be able to move it once, okay, and it will move the skier or the ball to whichever location, and then if we move the device again, it won't carry on tracking the motion. So we need to use a different method. Now all of these methods inside of the Accelerometer API are supported by Android, iPhone, and the BlackBerry WebWorks OS 5.0 and higher platforms. So we're now going to take a look at the accelerometer watch acceleration method. This gets the device's current acceleration at a regular interval. So instead of just capturing that data and then displaying it, what we can do is we can keep capturing that data and we can keep updating that information to the user, which is really great. And again, this will be required for games and stuff like that, where we need to keep track of the motion of the device. So what we're going to do is we are going to delete this out, okay, and I'm going to create a variable and give this variable a name. So I'll just call this watch ID, and its value will be equal to null, basically meaning that it has no value. And now what I want to do is, inside of this function that's being triggered when Phonegap is ready, I want to assign a value to that variable. So I say watch ID equals, and then I say Navigator dot accelerometer dot watch acceleration with a capital A. And just like before, the first thing we're going to define is the accelerometer success callback. So that will be the onSuccess function. Then I'm going to define the accelerometer error callback, which is the onError function. And then what we're going to do is we're going to define our optional parameters. Now, your optional parameters are put basically inside of parentheses, okay, and then we can type the name of the optional parameter, which is the frequency optional parameter, and basically this is going to tell it how frequently we want to capture that information in milliseconds. So if I was to say 500, that would mean 500 milliseconds, or half a second. So every half a second we're going to capture this information, okay, and we're going to keep capturing it. And then I'm going to end my brackets and end with a semicolon. You also have an option of basically storing your optional parameters in a variable, which is what I like to do. So I'm going to create another variable, give it the variable a name so we can point to it later on, so equals, so we're assigning a value to this variable, paste that in there, and then we can simply point to this variable, okay, and that way it just keeps stuff cleaner, because with other APIs you have, you know, sometimes lots and lots of optional parameters, so I'd rather keep that separate and, you know, keep the code nice and clean. But again, it's entirely up to you. Okay, so now what I want to do is I want to change this, because obviously we are capturing this data every half a second, and basically this alert dialog box, you know, they're going to have to click that every half a second to, you know, keep up to date. That's not really what we want. So what we need to do is we need to create a variable that points to our DOM element right here with the ID of Accelerometer, and then we can populate that. So let's go ahead and say equals document dot get element by ID. So we're looking inside of the DOM, we're going to put the quotation marks in, and inside of the quotation marks we're putting the ID. And again, Dreamweaver has intelligently found all the DOM elements with an ID. We're able to see what type of element it is, and also what document that DOM element is in. Okay, so now we want to close our brackets and end with a semicolon, and instead of an alert dialog box, what we're going to do is we're going to say element, so we're pointing to that DOM element, and then we're saying dot inner HTML. Okay, so we're using the inner HTML method, so basically that is going to now populate this div element that we've pointed to with the information that we request. So I just need to take off the ending bracket, okay, like so. Okay, that's nice and easy. And so now what I can do is I can save that, and we can go ahead and export this and install it on the device. Okay, so I've gone ahead and done that, so let's open this guy up. Okay, and as you can see, it is updating this information. So there's one piece of information, then I hit refresh, and then it's updating it again and again and again. Okay, let's tilt this so we get a complete wide variety. Okay, alright, so that's pretty cool. So basically every 500 milliseconds we are capturing that information, and we are also calling back the onSuccess function. And basically if you do not define your optional parameter, which is this frequency parameter, then basically it will default to getting that information and calling back the acceleration success callback every 10,000 milliseconds. So every 10 seconds it will call back our accelerometer success callback function. So bear that in mind. And basically what we want to do is now stop the accelerometer watch interval. So we want to completely stop watching it. We don't want to update the information after we tell it to stop. And the way we're going to do that is we're going to create an anchor tag. And when we click on this anchor tag, we're going to trigger a function which is going to be stop watch. Like so. Save that and then go to the myapp.js file again, and we're going to create that function. So we're going to say function. I'm going to give that function name stop watch. Now what we're going to do is we're going to say if, and then we're going to point to our variable, which is watch ID. Okay, so again, it's up to you what you name your variables, but I've just made this nice and simple, watch ID. And then what we're going to do is we're going to say watch ID, if it's not equal to null, then obviously it must be, you know, watching the accelerometer on a regular interval. So what we need to do is stop that. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to use the accelerometer.clearWatch method. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to say Navigator dot Accelerometer dot clear watch with a capital W, and then we need to define the watch ID parameter. Now basically this accelerometer.watch acceleration method returns a ID referencing the accelerometer watch interval. So what is that ID? Well, basically it's the same as your variable name. Okay, so you need to put in your ID name right there. Okay, and then we can end that with a semicolon, and then we can basically say watch ID, and we're assigning the value of null, which means that there is no value, and therefore it will stop watching. Okay, so now what I can do is I can save that, export it, and install it on the device. So now let's open this up like so. So as you can see, we're getting that information, refreshing. Okay, there you go. And now I'm going to click on stopwatch. Now you can see everything stopped. I can tilt that device and it still stays the same. Okay, so that's basically how we stop the accelerometer watch interval. And so now what we're going to do is first of all have a recap. Don't forget that all the methods that I've shown you, which is the accelerometer.getCurrentAcceleration and the watch acceleration and the clear watch methods, are supported on the Android, iPhone and the BlackBerry WebWorks OS 5.0 and higher platforms. Very important that you remember, you know, the support for stuff. Also, we have a few quirks with the getCurrentAcceleration method. There's a quirk on the iPhone. Basically, the iPhone doesn't have the concept of getting the current acceleration at any given point in time. So what we need to do is we need to, you know, obviously use our watch acceleration method, and then, you know, we can grab that information at a specific point in time and then do it that way. So okay, so that's a little bit of an issue. And we have a few quirks with the watch acceleration method. Basically, it's not very important, but if I was to set the frequency optional parameter to over 1,000 milliseconds, for example 5,000 milliseconds, then on the iPhone platform it will still, you know, capture that information from the accelerometer by default every 1 second. Okay, so it's still doing it, but our accelerometer success callback function is called every 5,000 milliseconds, so it's really not that big a deal. Okay, but obviously, you know, it is a quirk. Also on the iPhone platform, Phonegap restricts the interval to a minimum of every 40 milliseconds. That's on the iPhone platform, okay? And it sets it to a maximum of every 1000 milliseconds. Okay, so again, if you set it to 5000 milliseconds, it'll still populate our acceleration object every 1 second. However, our accelerometer success callback function will be called back at the time we've set on the frequency parameter. Okay, so that's basically it for this tutorial. Hope you've learnt a lot, and hope you continue learning all those great Phonegap APIs.